You think you know power? Meet Madeline Carter, a flight attendant who thought she had the world figured out. She knew who mattered and who didn't. She could pour whiskey with a dazzling smile for a man in first class but couldn't be bothered to help an elderly woman fasten her seatbelt. Big mistake, because that woman? She owned the entire airline. And by the time the plane touched the ground, Madeline would find herself stripped of everything she thought made her untouchable. This isn't just a story about karma. It's a front row seat to a reckoning in the sky where quiet power speaks louder than arrogance. And one flight attendant learns that the real turbulence isn't outside the plane, it's inside her own soul. But before we dive in, where in the world are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments. And if you love stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another one. Now buckle up. This flight is about to take a turn. Airplane fire. At first, it was nothing, just another moment in the quiet hum of travel. A breath lost in the rhythm of an ordinary day. The airplane cabin was alive with movement, passengers easing into their seats. Overhead bins slamming shut. Flight attendants gliding through the aisles with mechanical grace. The scent of recycled air mixed with traces of expensive perfume from first class. Voices layered over each other. Some hushed, some bold, blending into the ever-present murmur of people in transit. And then there was Eleanor James. She moved with the kind of deliberate care that comes with age, not frail. Not weak, but measured. A woman who had lived long enough to understand that time was not something to be rushed. Nor wasted. Her navy blue coat was buttoned neatly. Her silver curls pinned back. Her eyes sharp beneath the weight of years. She arrived at seat 7B, a window seat in business class, and lowered herself into it with a soft sigh. The seatbelt lay across the cushion beside her, its buckle glinting under the cabin lights. She reached for it. Her fingers found the fabric, curled around it, but her grip faltered. She tried again. The muscles in her hands had stiffened over the years, the small betrayals of time settling into her bones. She exhaled, scanning the aisle. A few rows ahead, Madeline Carter, a young blonde flight attendant, was caught in laughter with a first-class passenger. She stood with effortless poise, her uniform crisp, her every movement practiced. Eleanor waited. She was not a woman prone to impatience. Life had taught her that most things came, given time. But the laughter continued. She cleared her throat, gently, just enough to carry. "Excuse me, dear, could you help me for a moment?" Madeline turned, her bright smile flickering for the briefest of seconds. The irritation was there, quick and sharp. Before she smoothed it away, she glanced at the unbuckled seatbelt. "It's just a seatbelt, ma'am," she said, voice laced with something light, something dismissive. "You just need to pull it across and click it in." Eleanor nodded. "I tried, dear, but my hands aren't as steady as they used to be." Madeline barely concealed a sigh. She looked around, as if making sure no one of importance was watching. "I'll be back in a moment," she muttered, already turning away, already gone. Eleanor sat still. The moment stretched. Beside her, a man stirred. Malcolm Davis, a black man in his early 30s, watched the exchange with quiet intensity. He had been looking out the window, lost in his own thoughts, until the interaction pulled him back. He saw the way Madeline dismissed her, saw the way her voice, so light and warm when speaking to first-class passengers, had cooled when addressing Eleanor. He saw it because he had lived it. Eleanor reached for the seatbelt again, but Malcolm leaned over before she could try. His fingers moved quickly, clicking it into place with ease. "There," he said, voice low but kind. She turned to him with a small smile. "Thank you, son." Malcolm nodded, but his expression remained tense. Across the aisle, Margaret and Henry Whitmore, an older white couple, exchanged glances. Margaret pursed her lips. "Did you see that?" she murmured. Henry sighed, rubbing his temple. "I saw." She asked for help. Margaret continued, voice tight. "And that woman just walked away." Henry exhaled. "She doesn't know who she's dealing with." Margaret frowned. "That shouldn't matter." The plane continued to fill. The energy of the cabin shifted, settled. The final boarding call rang through the terminal. And somewhere, unseen, a message was sent. In first class, a man in a dark suit and salt and pepper hair sat quietly, watching. Walter Pierce had made a career out of reading people, of catching the moments that others missed. He had been in business long enough to know that power rarely announced itself. It sat back, watched, and waited. He had seen everything. Without a word, he reached into his pocket and sent a simple message. And just like that, the course of the flight had already changed. Madeline Carter just didn't know it yet. The engines roared to life. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap, gazing out the window as the plane gained speed. Beside her, Malcolm shifted, adjusting his seatbelt before muttering, "She should have helped you." Eleanor turned to him with that same small smile, something knowing in her expression. "People reveal who they are in the smallest moments," she said. "No need to correct them. Life will do it for them." Malcolm exhaled, but something about her words made him uneasy. Because there was no anger in them, no bitterness, just certainty. And that was what unsettled him most. At the front of the plane, Madeline moved through the first-class cabin, her smile easy again, her voice smooth and warm. She leaned slightly toward a well-dressed man, pouring his whiskey with careful precision. "Can I offer you anything else, Mr. Blackwell?" she asked, her tone syrupy sweet. He nodded. "Another whiskey, please." She flashed a perfect smile. "Of course." The intercom crackled above. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now at cruising altitude. The seatbelt sign has been turned off. You are free to move about the cabin. Our crew will begin service shortly." The plane steadied. The world above the clouds stretched wide, endless. Madeline turned toward the galley to fetch the drink when Mira Dawson, a junior flight attendant, hesitated at the entrance. She had been watching. She had seen it all. "Hey, Madeline," Mira said carefully. "Did you see the woman in 7B? The one who needed help earlier?" Madeline barely looked at her. She adjusted the tray in her hands. "Yeah, what about her?" Mira hesitated. "I mean, shouldn't someone have helped her?" Madeline scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Mira, we don't have time to babysit every single passenger. People should be able to handle a seatbelt without needing personal assistance." Mira frowned but said nothing. Madeline picked up the tray and walked back to first class, her heels clicking against the floor. She felt completely at ease. She had no idea that something had already been set into motion. Something that would change everything. Because back in the cockpit, the flight supervisor had just received a message from corporate. And as he read the name on the screen, his face stiffened. Eleanor James. A VIP. No, not just a VIP. The owner of the airline. The moment the realization set in, the weight of the cabin shifted. Madeline Carter had ignored the wrong woman. And before this flight landed, she was going to learn a lesson she would never forget. At first, it was just a whisper. A small ripple in the otherwise undisturbed current of the flight. A single name, spoken in the wrong ear. At the wrong time, or perhaps at precisely the right one. The first-class passengers were still relaxed, sipping whiskey and wine, stretching their legs in comfortable luxury. Business class remained steady, a quiet hum of passengers reading, dozing, or scrolling through their devices. Economy class, pressed toward the back of the plane, carried its own subdued energy, people who knew they had paid less, but still expected basic decency in return. But in the flight deck, the atmosphere had shifted. The flight supervisor, Thomas Raines, stood rigid near the radio panel, the color draining slightly from his face as he reread the message on his screen. The words were simple, but the weight they carried was anything but. Eleanor James is on board. Ensure she is treated with the highest level of service. He swallowed hard. This wasn't just another high-status passenger. This was the owner of the airline. His mind raced through the implications. If she was flying commercial, unannounced, it meant she wasn't looking for special treatment, she was watching, assessing. It meant that, at this very moment, she was quietly making decisions about the people who worked for her. And one of those people had ignored her. Raines turned sharply toward the flight manifest, scanning the list of assigned crew members. His eyes settled on a single name. Madeline Carter. A long exhale left his lips, heavy with understanding. He reached for the intercom, his fingers hovering over the call button. Not yet. Not before he had the full picture. "Do we have any reports on how she's been treated so far?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. Liam Foster, a junior communications officer seated nearby, hesitated before responding. I received a flagged report from one of the attendants monitoring the cabin." Raines turned to him. "Go on." Liam cleared his throat. She asked for assistance with her seatbelt. He paused, and she was ignored. Silence. Captain Jonathan Miles, who had been listening quietly from his seat, let out a slow breath, shaking his head. By who? Raines's jaw tightened. Madeline Carter. The name lingered in the air like a storm cloud, thick with unspoken warnings. Captain Miles exhaled through his nose, his fingers tapping against the armrest. She doesn't know, does she? Raines shook his head. Not yet. Meanwhile, in the galley, Madeline Carter adjusted the tray in her hands, pouring a fresh glass of whiskey for a first-class passenger. Her confidence fully intact. She was in her element. This was her domain, where she decided who was worth her time and who wasn't. She had spent years perfecting the art of selective service, giving warmth to those she deemed important and distance to those she didn't. It had never backfired before. But something was off now. A subtle shift in the air. She noticed it in the way Mira Dawson, the junior flight attendant, watched her with something that looked dangerously close to pity. In the way passengers in business class whispered behind cupped hands, their eyes flicking toward seat 7B more often than before. And then, the intercom buzzed. Madeline Carter, report to the galley immediately. The words were calm, professional, but beneath them was a weight that sent a quiet chill down her spine. Her eyes darted toward Thomas Raines, who stood waiting in the galley with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Nathan Hayes and Issa Grant, two senior attendants, were already there, shifting uncomfortably. Madeline forced a polite smile, tilting her head as she stepped inside. Is there a problem? Raines didn't waste time. Do you know who's sitting in 7B? Madeline blinked. What? Raines's voice sharpened. Business class. Row 7. Elderly woman. Silver hair. Navy coat. Madeline frowned. Yeah, I know who you mean. What about her? Raines's gaze darkened. That's Eleanor James. The moment the words left his mouth, it was as if the entire galley tilted. Madeline's breath caught. Her stomach dropped so fast it felt like turbulence had ripped through her body. She opened her mouth then closed it. The realization settled in like cold stone. She had dismissed her, ignored her, brushed her off like she was nobody. And Eleanor James, the Eleanor James, hadn't said a single word, hadn't demanded respect, hadn't drawn attention to herself. She had simply waited, letting Madeline reveal herself. Raines stepped closer, his voice low but firm. Corporate is aware. The captain is aware. And now, I need to know exactly what happened. Madeline's instincts kicked in. I didn't do anything wrong, she said quickly. She was struggling with her seatbelt. And I was busy. From the corner, Mira Dawson scoffed softly. Madeline's head snapped toward her. Something funny? Mira met her gaze, unflinching. You weren't too busy for the first-class passengers. Madeline's breath hitched. Raines inhaled slowly, shaking his head. This isn't just about ignoring a passenger, Carter. This is about ignoring the wrong passenger. Silence. Then, he delivered the final blow. You're going to walk back to 7B and offer a personal apology. Madeline's stomach twisted. What? Right now? Her hands clenched into fists. She didn't even complain. She didn't have to. Raines's voice was clipped. Final. If you don't do this, you won't have to worry about landing this job again. Madeline inhaled sharply. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but one glance at the other flight attendants told her there was no way out of this. She had already been judged. And now, she was about to be sentenced. As she walked down the aisle, the cabin felt different. The air was heavier. The whispers were louder. Passengers watched her now, some subtle, some not. Malcolm Davis sat with his arms crossed, eyes cool but knowing. Margaret Whitmore glanced up from her book, studying her over the rim of her glasses. And then, she reached seat 7B. Eleanor James sat there, still as ever, flipping through a magazine, completely unbothered. Madeline swallowed hard, her breath uneven. She forced a tight smile. Mrs. James, she began, her voice just a little too high. I wanted to apologize for earlier. Eleanor turned the page. Apologize for what, dear? The words were soft, almost amused. And in that moment, Madeline knew. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. At first, there was nothing but silence. It stretched between them, thick and deliberate, like a held breath before a storm. Madeline Carter stood there, hands clasped in front of her, her forced smile tightening as seconds passed. The weight of every watching eye pressed against her skin. Unseen but undeniable. And yet, Eleanor James did not look at her. The elderly woman remained as she was, seated comfortably in 7B. Her navy blue coat draped neatly around her shoulders, her fingers tracing the edge of the magazine she had been flipping through. She was waiting for Madeline to understand that this moment was no longer hers to control. The first crack in Madeline's composure came in the form of a nervous swallow. "I wanted to apologize for earlier." She tried again, her voice softer now, less certain. Eleanor finally turned a page. "Apologize for what, dear?" The words were light, almost kind, but they cut deeper than any reprimand Madeline had ever received. Because Eleanor wasn't asking out of confusion. She was asking to see what Madeline would say if she would admit what they both knew. Or if she would twist the truth to make herself feel better. Madeline's fingers twitched at her sides. She wanted this to be simple. A quick apology, a polite nod, and then she could move on. But Eleanor's calm, unwavering presence made it clear this wasn't going to be easy. "I didn't mean to ignore you," she said quickly. Eleanor hummed, a sound that held neither acceptance nor forgiveness. Madeline rushed to fill the space. "I was busy." The second the words left her lips, she knew it was the wrong thing to say. Eleanor lifted her gaze, and for the first time, she truly looked at her. Not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with something much worse. With the quiet weight of a woman who had seen this all before. "You were busy," Eleanor repeated, her tone gentle. "Busy doing what, exactly?" Madeline opened her mouth, closed it. She could feel her pulse in her throat. From across the aisle, Malcolm Davis leaned back in his seat, watching. Margaret Whitmore set her book down, tilting her head slightly. Henry Whitmore exhaled through his nose. They were all waiting. Madeline felt her stomach tighten. She had spent years controlling narratives, maneuvering conversations so that she always walked away the winner. But this time, she had no way out. "I was attending to first-class passengers," she admitted. Eleanor's expression didn't change. "You had time to pour whiskey," she said softly. "Time to ask a man if he wanted another drink. Time to smile and laugh." Madeline's breath hitched. But when an elderly black woman asked for help with something as small as a seatbelt, Eleanor continued, "You decided she wasn't worth your time." The words landed with the force of truth, cutting through the last of Madeline's self-denial. She felt exposed, small. Her heart pounded. "That's not it wasn't about." Eleanor raised a hand, silencing her with a single gesture. "Think carefully before you finish that sentence," she said. A chill ran down Madeline's spine. Eleanor wasn't scolding her. She wasn't raising her voice. But somehow, her calm, steady presence was more devastating than rage could ever be. Because Eleanor knew. She had lived this moment. In 100 different forms. On 100 different days. She had been overlooked in restaurants. Ignored in stores. Spoken over in meetings. Dismissed in rooms where her presence should have commanded respect. She had seen this exact face. On this exact kind of woman. Before. Women who smiled in the presence of power but sneered when they believed power was absent. Women who knew how to serve but only when they thought the recipient was worthy. Women like Madeline Carter. Madeline's hands trembled slightly, though she tried to hide it. This wasn't just an apology anymore. It was a reckoning. From the front of the plane, a soft chime rang over the intercom. A voice calm and professional filtered through the speakers. "Senior flight attendants, report to the galley immediately." The air inside the cabin shifted. Passengers exchanged glances. Some pretended not to notice. But everyone knew something was happening. Something bigger than just a seatbelt. Madeline stiffened. She knew what this meant. They were going to talk about her. They were going to decide what happened next. Her breath quickened. She looked at Eleanor, desperate now, her pride unraveling at the edges. "I didn't mean to." Eleanor picked up her glass of water. Took a slow sip. Then, with devastating ease, she spoke the words that sealed Madeline's fate. "Apologies mean nothing when they're only given out of fear." Madeline stilled, because she knew. She knew that Eleanor was right. That she hadn't apologized because she regretted what she had done. She had apologized because she had gotten caught. And now, she was out of time. A voice from behind her cut through the tension. It was Thomas Raines. "Madeline," he said. She turned, already knowing what she would see. Oliver Raines, the flight supervisor. 2 security officers. standing just behind him. Passengers whispered. Margaret Whitmore covered her mouth with her hand. The entire plane had shifted against her. "Come with us," Oliver said, his voice unreadable. Madeline couldn't move. She felt the weight of everyone watching. The weight of a lifetime of believing she was above consequence, crashing down on her all at once. This was it. This was the moment that divided before from after. She turned back to Eleanor one last time. The older woman's expression remained unchanged. She had said all she needed to say. And now, the rest would take care of itself. Madeline took a slow, shaky breath. And then, with every step she took toward the front of the plane, she realized she had never felt smaller in her life. The air inside the galley felt thick, heavy with something unspoken, something that had been simmering beneath the surface for years but had only now come to a boil. Madeline Carter stood in the middle of it, her back straight, her breath shallow, her pulse hammering in her throat. The soft hum of the engines was the only sound for a moment. Then, the door to the flight deck opened, and Thomas Raines stepped inside, his expression unreadable. He was followed by Oliver Raines, the flight supervisor, and behind him 2 security officers. Madeline's stomach dropped. This wasn't just a scolding. This was a formal intervention. She had seen this before, had watched it happen to other attendants who had crossed a line they weren't supposed to cross. Some had been rude to passengers. Others had made a mistake too big to ignore. But never had she imagined she would be standing here like this, waiting to hear what her own punishment would be. Oliver's voice was calm, but cold. "Do you understand the severity of this situation?" Madeline's throat felt dry. "I didn't know who she was," she said, her voice weaker than she wanted it to be. Oliver's jaw tightened. That's exactly the problem. A silence stretched between them, tense and suffocating. Madeline knew what he meant. She had dismissed Eleanor James because she hadn't recognized her. Because in her mind, Eleanor had been just another elderly black woman, unimportant, invisible, not worth the effort. And now, that assumption had unraveled her entire world. Oliver took a step closer, lowering his voice. She didn't file a complaint. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. She didn't have to. Madeline's hands curled into fists. "I didn't mean any harm," she said, her voice wavering. Oliver studied her, and for a second, just a second, there was something almost like pity in his expression. "That's the thing, Carter," he said, his voice softer now. "People like you never think they mean harm." The words hit her like a slap. She felt the room tilt, her own thoughts caving in on themselves. "People like you." She wanted to argue, wanted to defend herself, but how could she? She had spent years choosing who mattered and who didn't. She had smiled for the businessmen, laughed with the wealthy, ignored the rest. Now, she was being forced to see herself through someone else's eyes. And the image was ugly. Oliver exhaled through his nose, then glanced at the security officers. "As of now," he said, his voice hardening, "you're being placed on immediate unpaid suspension pending further review." Madeline's breath caught. "No, wait." His eyes darkened. "Upon landing, you will be escorted off the aircraft for a formal hearing with the executive board." The words rang in her skull, heavy and inescapable. She felt like the air had been sucked out of the cabin. Like she was falling, even though the plane remained steady in the sky. Her entire career, the thing she had built, the thing she had prided herself on, the thing she had believed made her better than others, was slipping through her fingers. And Eleanor James? She was still sitting there in 7B, unbothered, untouched, never having raised her voice, never having demanded anything, because she hadn't needed to. Madeline had destroyed herself. Meanwhile, in the cabin, the energy had shifted. Passengers who had once ignored the small, passing moment between Madeline and Eleanor now felt its echoes rippling through the air. Margaret Whitmore leaned closer to her husband. "She's getting escorted off the flight, isn't she?" she whispered. Henry sighed. "Looks like it." Margaret pursed her lips. "I don't feel sorry for her." Henry didn't respond because what was there to say? A few rows away, Malcolm Davis had his arms crossed, watching as the murmurs grew. Eleanor, beside him, remained as calm as ever. "She didn't see this coming," Malcolm murmured. Eleanor smiled faintly. "They never do." Back in the galley, Madeline couldn't breathe. Her mind was racing, her pulse hammering. "Please," she whispered, barely realizing she had spoken. Oliver's expression didn't change. "This isn't negotiable." Her pride screamed at her to argue. But what could she say? That she hadn't meant it? That she wasn't a bad person? That she had just been following instinct? Even as she tried to form the words, she felt how hollow they were. She had lived her life on assumptions. And now, she was paying for them. Mira Dawson, the junior attendant, shifted in the corner, her expression unreadable. Madeline turned to her, almost desperate. You really think I deserve this? Mira held her gaze for a long moment. Then, she spoke the truth that Madeline didn't want to hear. I think this is the first time you've ever had to face the consequences of who you are. The words landed like a final blow. Madeline felt her legs tremble beneath her. She had never felt powerless before. But now she was. The world around her had changed. And there was no undoing it. The voice of the captain crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened. Flight attendants, prepare for landing. Madeline felt the plane begin to lower. Felt the shift in altitude pressing against her chest. Her fate was sealed. She had spent so much time looking down on people. And now, she was the one falling. She knew, deep down, that when this plane touched the ground, her entire life would be different. But what terrified her most was that for the first time, she had no control over what happened next. The plane tilted slightly as it descended, the soft hum of the engines shifting into something heavier, something more deliberate. Inside the cabin, passengers adjusted their seatbelts, closed their books, finished their drinks. Some peered absently out of the window at the land below, their minds already reaching toward whatever waited for them on the ground. But for Madeline Carter, the descent was not just one of altitude. She was falling, and there was no seatbelt in the world that could hold her steady now. The whispers had started long before the intercom signaled their approach. They had begun as flickers of conversation, barely noticeable over the hum of the aircraft. But now, they were sharper, louder, weaving through the cabin like an unshakable current. Did you see how she ignored that woman? They're pulling her off the flight, aren't they? She had it coming. She thought she was above all this. Madeline's face burned, but she kept her eyes forward, her jaw tight. She had never been one of those people, the ones who shrank under scrutiny, who let themselves be seen and judged. She had always been the one watching, the one deciding. Now, for the first time, she was the one being examined and no one was looking away. She felt it, the weight of every glance, every hushed murmur, every moment she had thought she was in control only to realize she had never been in control at all. And then, from row 7B, came a voice, soft, steady, but carrying more power than any decree she had ever heard. People always show who they are. Sooner or later. Madeline's hands clenched into fists. She knew who had spoken before she even turned. Eleanor James, the woman who had never raised her voice, who had never demanded justice, who had simply waited, because she had known from the beginning how this would unfold. Eleanor did not look at her. She was gazing out of the window, watching the city below come into view, as if she had already moved on from Madeline entirely. And perhaps she had, because this was never about her. This was about a much bigger story, one that had existed long before Madeline Carter ever put on a flight attendant's uniform. The final approach was announced, and the flight attendants took their seats. But Madeline didn't sit. She was still standing in the galley, her breath shallow, her body tense. Oliver Raines, the flight supervisor, stood nearby, arms crossed. "Take your seat, Carter," he said, voice even. Madeline hesitated. She wanted to say something, anything, but what words were left? What excuse could possibly undo what had already been written? Her feet felt heavy as she finally turned, moving toward the front jump seat. The cabin tilted again as the plane dropped lower. Lower. The lights of the city now sharp and clear below them. Madeline sat. The moment she did, she felt the finality of it. The way everything had shifted. As if she had stepped out of one life and into another. There was no escaping it now. When this plane landed, she would be escorted off like a problem that needed to be removed. She could feel it, the world she had known slipping away. The certainty she had once carried now crumbling into something she couldn't quite name. The final announcement came through the speakers. "Cabin crew, prepare for landing." And then, with a slight jolt, the wheels touched the ground. The plane roared against the runway, the weight of it pressing down, forcing it into place. Madeline's pulse pounded in her ears. For the first time, She wondered what it would be like to step into an airport without her uniform. Without the certainty of knowing where she belonged. For the first time, she realized she didn't know who she was outside of this job. The plane slowed, the movement gentler now, controlled. And yet, for Madeline, everything still felt like it was spinning. In the moments after landing, there was a stillness, a brief, fragile pause before everything unraveled. Then, the seatbelt sign dinged, and chaos returned. Passengers stood, reaching for bags, stretching their legs. The overhead bins popped open one after another. The murmur of conversation building again. But in the front of the aircraft, waiting just beyond the jet bridge, 2 security officers stood waiting. Madeline saw them the second the doors opened. She went cold. They weren't here for some routine matter. They were waiting for her. A lump formed in her throat as Oliver turned toward her, his face expressionless. "Time to go," he said. Back in 7B, Eleanor James gathered her purse. She moved with that same measured grace. Never rushed, never flustered. She didn't watch as Madeline was led away. She didn't have to, because this was never about punishment. It was about truth, and the truth had already revealed itself. As she stood, Malcolm Davis met her gaze. "She's not gonna forget this," he murmured. Eleanor smiled faintly. "No," she said, "she won't." And with that, she stepped off the plane, leaving Madeline Carter behind, alone with the wreckage of the life she had built. The airport terminal swallowed her whole. Madeline Carter moved through it as if caught in a current, each step dragging her deeper into something she could no longer control. The murmur of travelers carefree, indifferent pressed in from every direction. Laughter, footsteps, the rustling of luggage wheels against linoleum floors. It was a world she had walked through 1,000 times before. But never like this. Never with 2 security officers flanking her on either side. Never with the weight of eyes on her, some subtle, others blatant, all of them watching her as if they knew. She had spent years watching others, deciding which passengers were worth her effort, her attention, her service. Now, she was the spectacle, and there was nowhere to hide. At the gate, Eleanor James stood near a lounge entrance, sipping a cup of tea. She was in no hurry. She had lived long enough to know that truth did not need to be chased, it revealed itself in time. Across the room, Malcolm Davis watched Madeline's slow procession. His gaze steady, his expression unreadable. "She looks like she's just realized it's over," he murmured. Eleanor didn't look up. It was over the moment she chose who mattered. Malcolm exhaled, shaking his head. "She could have changed," he said after a moment. Eleanor finally glanced at him, a knowing smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Could she? Malcolm had no answer. Because the truth was simple. Change did not come from fear. It did not come from exposure. From consequence. From the humiliation of being caught. Change came from within, from the realization that the world was never what you thought it was. That it did not bend to your assumptions. That the people you had dismissed never needed your permission to exist. And some people like Madeline Carter only learned that when it was too late. The automatic doors of the private conference wing slid open. Inside, a small group of executives stood waiting. James Holloway, one of the senior decision-makers at the airline, clasped his hands in front of him. His expression was calm but firm, the look of a man who had already made up his mind. And beside him Callum Vance. Madeline stiffened. She had spent the entire flight ignoring him, thinking him just another first-class passenger. Now, she understood who he really was. A businessman with deep industry ties. A man whose single email to the executive board had changed the course of her entire career. And he was here, not because he needed to be, but because he had chosen to be. Madeline's pulse pounded. She had never felt so small. The moment she stepped inside, the doors slid shut behind her. The security officers didn't follow. They didn't need to. This was not an arrest. This was an execution. James Holloway didn't waste time. "Miss Carter," he said, flipping open a file in front of him. "Do you have any idea why you're here?" Madeline licked her lips. "I assume this is about the passenger in 7B. James raised an eyebrow. "Passenger?" He tapped the folder lightly. "You mean Eleanor James?" Madeline's stomach twisted. James leaned forward. "Let's be clear. Mrs. James did not file a complaint. She didn't have to. Enough people saw what happened, including your own crew members." His gaze flicked toward Oliver Raines, who stood near the door. silent but firm. Madeline's fingers curled into fists. She had built her career on pleasing the right people, on knowing which passengers mattered, on ensuring that those in first class felt seen, respected, catered to. But she had never considered this possibility. That the one person she dismissed would be the only one who actually had the power to decide her fate. James exhaled slowly, his voice smooth but sharp. This airline was built on one thing: customer service. Every single person who steps onto our aircraft deserves to be treated with respect. His eyes hardened. That includes the young, the old, the rich, the economy flyers, and, yes, even the ones you assumed weren't important. The words cut deeper than any reprimand she had ever received. James leaned back in his chair. So tell me, Miss Carter. His voice lowered, razor sharp. If Mrs. James had been just another passenger, if she hadn't owned this airline, would you have even cared? The question landed like a blow. The room went silent. Madeline's throat tightened, because the answer was sitting between them, thick and undeniable. No, she wouldn't have cared. She would have walked off that plane, forgotten the moment entirely, moved on with her life, never thinking twice about the elderly black woman who had simply needed help. James watched her, waiting. Callum Vance shifted, folding his arms across his chest. Oliver Raines exhaled sharply. Madeline said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. James exchanged a glance with one of the other executives, then closed the file in front of him. We'll be making our final decision soon, he said, but the decision had already been made. Until then, James continued, you are officially placed on unpaid suspension, effective immediately. Madeline's stomach dropped. Unpaid. That was it. Then, the job she had built her entire identity around, the thing that had made her feel powerful. Untouchable. Secure was slipping away. James's voice was even. Security will escort you out. She wanted to argue, to beg for another chance, to explain. But what could she say that would matter? What words could undo what had already been done? The security officers stepped forward, and Madeline Carter stood. Her legs shook beneath her. She had spent so long believing she was untouchable. Now, she wasn't even sure if she'd ever step foot on another plane again. As she walked back through the airport, Eleanor James sat exactly where she had been before. Unbothered, untouched. The world around her had changed, but she remained the same. Madeline didn't look at her. She couldn't. But just as she passed, Eleanor's voice, soft, steady, reached her ears. I hope this moment stays with you. Madeline's breath hitched. Not because of the words, but because they weren't said with anger or cruelty. They were said with certainty. As if Eleanor already knew that this flight would follow Madeline Carter for the rest of her life. That no matter where she went, no matter how hard she tried to forget, she never would. The airport doors slid open, and the world outside hit Madeline Carter like a slap, cold air. City sounds. The indifferent hum of life moving on without her. She stood at the curb, her carry-on suitcase beside her, though it suddenly felt like she had no place to go. For years, this airport had been hers, her domain, her stage. She had walked through it with the confidence of someone who knew she belonged. Now, she was no different than the people she used to overlook. A nobody. She tightened her coat around her shoulders, but it did nothing to keep the chill from seeping in. Behind her, the automatic doors continued their rhythmic slide, opening, closing. The world kept moving. And she? She was stuck. Inside the airport lounge, Eleanor James stirred her tea. The porcelain clinked softly against the spoon, a sound that was both familiar and final. Across from her, Malcolm Davis leaned back in his chair, watching through the glass as Madeline stood outside. She doesn't know where to go, he murmured. Eleanor didn't look up. That's because she's never had to think about where she stood before. Malcolm exhaled, shaking his head. You think this'll change her? Eleanor let the question settle between them. Did people change? Or did they only learn to fear the consequences of being seen for who they truly were? She set her spoon down, folding her hands over her lap. That's up to her. Malcolm scoffed lightly. I wouldn't put money on it. Eleanor finally glanced up, the trace of a smile in her eyes. Neither would I. But it was never about betting on people. Was it? It was about whether they had the courage to bet on themselves. Outside, Madeline turned, reaching for her phone. She had been waiting for something, a message, a call, some kind of reassurance that this wasn't real. That this was all just a bad moment that would pass. But there was nothing. No missed calls. No texts. She had spent years believing that she was somebody. That she was too good to be discarded. That her job was safe because she knew how to cater to the right people. But now, there was no one reaching for her. No one calling to check in. No one who cared. The realization landed hard. She had spent so much time building herself up by looking down on others that she had never stopped to consider what would happen when there was no one left beneath her. A voice pulled her from her thoughts. Didn't expect you to still be standing here. Madeline's head snapped up. Malcolm Davis stood a few feet away. Hands in his pockets. Expression unreadable. She glared at him before she could stop herself. Come to watch me fall apart? Malcolm tilted his head slightly. No, he said. That part already happened on the plane. Her jaw clenched. She wanted to snap back. To wound him. To reclaim some piece of control. But she had none. Not anymore. Malcolm sighed, glancing at the cars pulling in and out of the curbside lane. I don't think you're a bad person, he said suddenly. Madeline stiffened. But, he continued, I think you thought you could decide who mattered. And today, you learned that you never had that power to begin with. She looked away, the sting of his words cutting too deep. Malcolm studied her for a long moment. Then shrugged. You could do something with this. You know. Madeline let out a dry laugh. Do something? Like what? My career's over. Malcolm gave her a sideways glance. Maybe. He paused. But maybe this is just the first time you're being asked to be better. She hated how much those words hit her. Because she had spent her entire life believing that she was already the best. And now? Now, she wasn't even sure who she was at all. The airport continued its steady pulse around them, passengers arriving. Others leaving. Life moving as it always had. And Madeline Carter stood there. A woman on the edge of a story she never thought would be hers. A story about reckoning. A story about consequence. A story about the cost of silence. She had a choice now. To let this moment break her. Or to let it change her. The problem was, she had never been good at making the right choice. Madeline Carter sat on the cold metal bench outside the airport. Her suitcase beside her, her career behind her, and her future a blank page she had never learned how to write for herself. The world around her kept moving. As it always did. Planes taxied on the tarmac. Cars pulled in and out of the arrivals lane. Voices drifted through the open-air laughter. Arguments. Hurried conversations about baggage and missed connections. She was used to being a part of it. But now, she was just a witness. And she hated it. Her fingers curled around the edge of the bench. She should have been on that plane. Walking through the aisles. Pouring drinks. Charming the right people. She should have been preparing for her next flight. Her next day. Her next moment of control. Instead, she was here. Waiting for what, exactly? A second chance? Some miracle to undo what had been done? Or just for the ground to swallow her whole? She let out a bitter laugh. Shaking her head. She had spent years looking down at people who lingered in airports without purpose, people stuck. People lost. Now, she was one of them. The terminal doors slid open behind her. She didn't turn, didn't care. Not until a voice, low and steady, broke through the air like a quiet truth. You're still here. Madeline closed her eyes. She knew that voice. Eleanor James. For a moment, she thought about not answering. Letting silence be her last defense. Her last act of defiance. But there was something about Eleanor that made silence feel pointless. So she opened her eyes and looked up. Eleanor stood there, calm as ever. Her navy blue coat buttoned neatly. Her purse hanging from her wrist. There was no judgment in her eyes. No cruelty. No victory. Just knowing. Madeline swallowed. Her voice cracked. She tried again. I don't know where to go. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. Considering this, is that the first time you've ever had to ask yourself that? Madeline looked away. The answer was yes. She had always known where she was going. Or at least, she had convinced herself she did. She had walked through life believing that as long as she followed the rules, as long as she pleased the right people, kept her uniform crisp, and her smile selective, she would always be safe. But safety was never about uniforms. And it was never about pleasing people who looked like her. It had always been about something else entirely, something she had refused to see. Eleanor sighed, shifting her purse to her other arm. You're waiting for someone to tell you what happens next. Madeline's jaw clenched. That wasn't a question. And she hated how true it was. Across the street, Malcolm Davis leaned against a pillar. Watching. He had seen enough people in his life fall from grace to know what this moment was. It was a crossroads. Not the kind that came with big, dramatic decisions. No flashing lights. No grand announcements. Just a quiet, simple choice. To stay who you were. Or to finally become someone else. Eleanor turned slightly, glancing at him. Malcolm sighed. Let's see if she gets it, he murmured. Madeline took a breath, shaky and uneven. I don't know how to fix this. Eleanor lifted an eyebrow. Fix what? Madeline blinked. Everything, she said, a little too fast. My job, my reputation, what people think of me. Eleanor's soft chuckle cut through the air like a blade. You're still worried about what people think of you? Madeline stiffened. Because yes, that was exactly what she was worried about. She wasn't thinking about the years of quiet harm she had done. The passengers she had ignored. The people she had decided weren't worth her time. She was thinking about herself. How she had fallen. How she had been seen in her weakest moment. How she had been dragged from her pedestal and forced to sit here. Like one of them. One of the people she had never looked at twice. Eleanor let the silence sit. Then, with devastating simplicity, she asked, do you even want to be better? Or do you just want things to go back to the way they were? The question landed like a blow. Because there was only one right answer. And Madeline didn't have it yet. Malcolm checked his watch. I give her a minute. He muttered. Eleanor smiled, slow and knowing. I give her longer. Malcolm exhaled, shaking his head. She might just walk away from this unchanged. Eleanor nodded, but her expression remained calm. Maybe, she tilted her head, or maybe this is the first time she's realizing that's not an option. Madeline Carter sat on the edge of her own life, staring down a road she had never thought she would have to walk. For the first time, there was no safety net. No guarantee that if she just smiled at the right person, all would be forgiven. She wasn't sure what scared her more, losing everything she had known, or finally seeing the truth of herself. But for the first time in a very, very long time, she realized she had a choice. Not about her job, not about what came next, but about who she wanted to be from here on out. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her phone. She scrolled through the contact list past colleagues who had already distanced themselves. Past numbers that had once mattered but no longer did. And then, she found the name she was looking for. She hesitated. Then, before she could stop herself, she pressed call. The line rang once, twice. Then, on the third ring, a voice picked up. Madeline? It was Mira Dawson, the junior flight attendant she had dismissed so many times before. There was hesitation in Mira's voice. Caution. And Madeline understood why. She deserved it. She took a deep breath. I need to talk, she said, her voice softer than it had ever been. There was a long silence. Then, finally, I'm listening. Eleanor James smiled to herself as she walked away. She didn't need to hear the conversation. She had seen enough people like Madeline in her life to know that redemption never came easy. But every story had to start somewhere. And maybe, just maybe, this was the first time Madeline Carter had finally begun hers.